Before you watch, like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from so we can deliver even more videos to you. The unraveling, colorful balloons danced in the gentle breeze as children chased each other between tables adorned with superhero themes. At the heart of it all, Sarah Miller adjusted her son's bow tie, her delicate fingers smoothing the fabric with the care of someone arranging not just an outfit, but a piece of her own heart. "Are you nervous, my love?" Sarah asked, watching her son's eyes, so much like her own, sparkle with anticipation. "A little," Ethan confessed, bouncing on his heels. "Do you think Daddy will like my party?" The innocent question made Sarah swallow hard. Mark had been absent in recent months, always with excuses about important meetings, business trips, unavoidable commitments. She smiled, masking the pain she felt every time her son asked about his father. "Of course he will. Today is your special day. Have you ever felt how a single moment can split your life into a before and after? How one sentence can redefine the contours of everything you believe to be true?" For Sarah, that moment arrived the instant she walked through the main hall, carrying the birthday cake carefully decorated with 5 lit candles. Mark, her husband of 7 years, entered through the main door. He wasn't alone. A woman with auburn hair and an elegant silhouette accompanied him, her fingers intertwined with his, with an intimacy that left no doubt. The murmur of conversations died down. Time seemed to slow as the guests' gazes shifted between the newly arrived couple and Sarah, who remained frozen in the center of the hall, cake in hand, smiles around her fading like popped soap bubbles. "Sarah," Mark's voice cut through the growing silence, cold as steel. "We need to talk." It was there, before dozens of guests, under the confused gaze of her birthday boy, that Mark announced his departure. The words came out like calculated projectiles, hitting Sarah with devastating precision. "I'm leaving you and Ethan. Jessica and I are going to start our lives together. I've always loved her, since university. I tried to make our marriage work, but I can't pretend anymore." The world around Sarah began to spin. Her hands trembled, making the cake candles dance erratically. She felt the hot wax drip onto her fingers, but the physical pain barely registered, compared to the emotional devastation that engulfed her. "Mommy, why is Daddy talking like that?" Ethan's small voice brought her back to the cruel reality. Her eyes met her son's, innocent, confused, scared. Something inside her broke and strengthened simultaneously. The days that followed passed like a hazy blur. Relatives trying to console, friends offering help, lawyers discussing settlements. Sarah moved mechanically, protecting Ethan as best she could, while her own heart bled silently. Sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of their marriage, searching for signs she had missed, clues she had ignored. She needed to get out of the mansion. Every room carried memories that now seemed tainted. With limited resources, Mark had controlled the finances throughout their marriage. Sarah found a small apartment across the city. It wasn't much, but it would be the fresh start she and Ethan needed. "I know it's not what we're used to," she said, as she helped her son choose which wall to stick his dinosaur posters on. "But we're going to turn this place into our new home, okay?" Ethan looked around, his eyes taking in the modest space, then smiled with the peculiar wisdom only children possess. "It's smaller, but it also means we're closer to each other, doesn't it?" Her son's simple words were the first ray of light amidst the darkness that had settled in Sarah's soul. What would you have done in Sarah's shoes? How do you cope when your world is turned upside down? Share your advice and experiences in the comments. Don't forget to like this video if you're hooked, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of resilience. A mother's fight weeks turned into months. New challenges arose, finding a job that allowed her to care for Ethan, dealing with questions she had known her for. Why doesn't Daddy visit me? managing money that barely covered basic expenses, and worst of all, the anxiety attacks that began to plague her. At first, they were just moments of shortness of breath. Later, full-blown attacks that left her trembling, heart racing, unable to function. She tried to hide it from everyone, especially Ethan, but the condition worsened. "You need to see a doctor," insisted Emily, her sister, after witnessing a particularly severe attack. "This isn't normal, Sarah. I'm worried." Reluctantly, Sarah eventually agreed. The waiting room of the doctor's office was cold and impersonal. She flipped through magazines without really seeing them. She watched people entering and leaving with expressions ranging from relief to concern. When she was finally called in, she broke down in tears as she tried to describe her symptoms. "I'm sorry," she murmured, wiping her face. "I'm not usually like this. I've always been strong." The doctor, Dr. Harrison, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, offered her a tissue. "Strength doesn't mean absence of tears, Ms. Miller. Sometimes it means crying and carrying on anyway." The tests were extensive. Sarah argued she couldn't afford all of them, but Emily insisted on helping. "Consider it a loan if you want, but I'm not letting you neglect your health." The follow-up appointment was when her world collapsed for the second time. "We have your test results," Dr. Harrison said in a controlled voice, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him before looking up at her. "We've identified a brain aneurysm." The office seemed to have run out of oxygen. Sarah heard the medical explanations as if they were coming from very far away. Risk of rupture, constant monitoring, possible treatments. "What's the prognosis?" she finally managed to ask, her voice trembling. The doctor's hesitation said everything before he even replied. "Without intervention, we estimate about 5 years. 5 years. Ethan would only be 10. Who would take care of him? Mark had already demonstrated his disinterest in being a father. How could she ensure her son would be protected, loved, safe? Upon leaving the consulting room, Sarah leaned against the corridor wall, her breath ragged. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that after having her heart broken, she now faced the possibility of losing her own life. It wasn't fair that Ethan could lose both parents, in different yet equally devastating ways. She decided not to tell anyone about the diagnosis, except Emily, who had accompanied her to the appointment and now cried silently beside her. "I won't give up," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to her sister. "I need to find a way to secure Ethan's future, no matter what happens to me." That night, after putting her son to sleep, Sarah rummaged through old boxes she had brought from the mansion. Among photos and memories, she found a dusty folder containing engineering projects she had developed before meeting Mark. She had graduated with honors, dreamed of a brilliant career, but everything had taken a back seat to support her husband's ambitions. One project in particular caught her attention: an innovative system for capturing and purifying rainwater, designed especially for regions with water scarcity. At the time, it seemed like just an idealistic dream of a recent graduate. Now, looking at it with more experience, Sarah realized the revolutionary potential of that idea. "What if," she murmured to herself, flipping through the detailed sketches and meticulous notes. The next day, picking Ethan up from school, she found him drawing alone in the playground while other children played. "No one wants to play with me," he explained, without looking up from his paper. "They say I don't have a daddy anymore." Sarah felt an invisible hand crush her heart. She knelt beside her son, gently lifting his chin so their eyes met. "Listen carefully, my love. You have a mom who loves you more than anything in this world. And guess what else? You have a mom who's going to show everyone that we're much stronger than they think." That same night, after Ethan fell asleep, Sarah began to update her old project. She worked tirelessly through the night, while constant headaches reminded her of the invisible hourglass that now controlled her life. Emily, noticing her renewed determination, suggested she enter the project in a startup competition focused on sustainability. "It's a chance, Sarah. You've always been brilliant. You just let Mark overshadow your light." The application was submitted with trembling hands. Sarah doubted her chances. It had been years since she worked professionally. She would be competing against established teams. She had extremely limited resources. But every time she looked at Ethan, sleeping peacefully in his modest room, she found the courage to continue. The waiting days were agonizing. Sarah divided her time between medical appointments, always hidden under excuses of work commitments, caring for Ethan, and refining her project. The anxiety attacks continued, though less frequent, replaced by a quiet determination that grew in her chest. "You look different," Emily commented, during a Sunday when they took Ethan to the park. "Stronger somehow." Sarah watched her son feeding ducks in the pond, laughing with a joy she believed had been stolen from him. "I have no choice," she replied simply. "I need to be strong for him, and perhaps also for myself." The call came on a rainy Thursday. Sarah had just served dinner when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was animated, almost euphoric. "Ms. Miller, I'm pleased to inform you that your Revive Waters project has been selected as a finalist for the National Sustainable Innovation Competition." She almost dropped the phone. A finalist. Among hundreds of projects, hers developed on a small kitchen table between medicine and school books had been recognized. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, Sarah allowed herself to cry for the first time since the diagnosis. They weren't tears of despair or self-pity, but of a timid hope that began to sprout like a stubborn flower between the cracks in the concrete. Sitting by the window of her small apartment, observing the illuminated city, Sarah whispered to herself, "5 years may not be enough to live everything I want, but it will be enough to build something that remains. For you, Ethan. For both of us." The rain beat against the window pane, transforming the city lights into colorful blurs, like tears that, instead of blurring her vision, actually clarified it. Sarah didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt she had the strength to rebuild it. Not as it was before, but as something entirely new, and, who knows, perhaps even more beautiful in its imperfection. Like the rainwater she intended to capture and transform in her project, Sarah was beginning to understand that sometimes we need to be completely shattered to discover how to remake ourselves. And in that process of reconstruction, perhaps we find parts of ourselves we didn't even know existed. Parts stronger, wiser, more resilient than we ever imagined we could be. What do you think will happen when Sarah faces Mark again, now as a successful entrepreneur? What role do you think her illness will play in her journey? Share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to stay tuned for the thrilling conclusion. A year had passed since the Revive Waters project's presentation at the competition finals. Sarah still vividly remembered that day, her trembling legs as she went on stage, her voice that insisted on failing as she explained her rainwater harvesting system, the cold sweat trickling down her back as judges took notes. Ethan was in the audience, holding a colorful sign where he had written, "My mom saves the world," in crooked, unaligned letters. It was the sight of that sign, that innocent smile, that gave Sarah the strength to finish her presentation, even when an episode of sharp pain threatened to break her composure. And then on the announcement that would change everything. First place, with a prize of £100,000 in seed capital, goes to Sarah Miller with the Revive Waters project. The auditorium erupted in applause. Emily, holding Ethan's hand, openly wept. Sarah remained motionless for a moment, unable to process what she had just heard. It took one of the judges to approach and gently guide her to the center of the stage for her to finally understand. She had won. I didn't prepare a speech," she confessed into the microphone, her voice trembling. Then her eyes met Ethan's in the audience. "But I want to dedicate this award to my son, who teaches me daily that no matter how difficult life can be, there's always a way to turn tears into something more valuable." Now, sitting in her small makeshift laboratory in the living room of her apartment, Sarah observed the prototypes she had built with that money. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The headaches persisted, constant reminders of the aneurysm that silently marked her time. But she had learned to work through them, hiding the most severe episodes from everyone around her. On the wall above her workbench, she had created a special calendar. It wasn't an ordinary calendar, marking appointments or deadlines. This calendar counted something much more precious: the days she had spent with Ethan since the diagnosis. Each filled square represented 24 hours, stolen from the sentence hanging over her. Each mark was a small victory against time. "Mummy, look what I made!" Ethan, now 7, ran up to her holding a drawing. It was a colorful representation of the system she had created, with fantastical additions, like a water slide for the water and little blue men who seemed to swim inside the pipes. "It's your invention," he explained proudly. "But improved." Sarah felt that familiar mix of love and pain as she looked at her son. His every achievement was precious, every smile, a treasure she eagerly collected, fearing she wouldn't have enough time to accumulate memories. In the darkest moments of the night, when she was alone with her thoughts, Sarah imagined Ethan growing up without her. Graduation, first girlfriend, university, marriage. All the milestones she might not witness. The idea was unbearable, and it was this pain that transformed her from a broken woman into a tireless warrior. "You know what?" she said, pulling him onto her lap, ignoring the sharp pain the simple movement caused. "I think you just gave me a brilliant idea. What if we add a cascading filtration system like your water slide?" Ethan's eyes lit up. "Then I'm an inventor too?" "The best one I know." Sarah kissed his forehead, absorbing the scent of children's shampoo and innocence. "How about we call ourselves Team Miller, like in the Olympics?" Ethan threw his arms up in a victory pose that drew a genuine laugh from Sarah, a sound increasingly rare in her life. "Exactly like that, champ." That night, while Ethan slept, Sarah feverishly worked on the new idea. The painkillers were almost gone, but she ignored the throbbing in her temples. Time was a luxury she didn't possess, and every wasted second was a second less in the legacy she was trying to build for her son. The small investment from the competition was rapidly dwindling. Between materials for prototypes, apartment rent, Ethan's school, and medications, which consumed a shocking portion of her budget, Sarah urgently needed to find additional funding or a client who believed in her project. "You can't go on like this," Emily confronted her on a particularly difficult morning when she arrived to pick Ethan up for school and found Sarah vomiting in the bathroom, a side effect of her medication. "You're killing yourself before the illness even has a chance." Sarah rinsed her mouth and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Deep, dark circles, pale skin, hair that was prematurely showing gray strands. "What do you suggest I do? Give up, lie in bed and wait for the end?" Emily sighed, holding her sister's hands. "I suggest you accept help. You don't have to carry the world alone." In the following weeks, after much insistence from Emily, Sarah finally hired an assistant, a young environmental engineering student named Chloe, who accepted a modest salary in exchange for experience and the possibility of adding Sarah's name to her resume. Chloe's presence allowed Sarah to attend her medical appointments without raising suspicion, and more importantly, ensured someone knew the technical details of the project in case the inevitable happened prematurely. The aneurysm is stable for now, informed Dr. Thomas, the new specialist who had taken over her case after a referral from Dr. Harrison. Dr. Thomas was younger, with an energy that contrasted with his predecessor's sobriety and a determination that Sarah secretly admired. But we need to monitor it closely. Any change in your symptoms, more intense pain, blurred vision, frequent dizziness, come immediately. She nodded, keeping to herself that the pains were worsening, that sometimes she woke with one side of her face numb, that on certain mornings her vision took a few minutes to fully clear. There was no time to be sick, not when her prototype was finally starting to attract the interest of small local investors. The first test installation of the Revive water system happened at a public school on the outskirts of the city. Sarah, Chloe, and a hired plumber worked an entire weekend to set up the system that would capture rainwater from the roof, filter it through the cascading mechanism inspired by Ethan's drawing, and store it in cisterns for use in irrigating the community garden. "Do you really think this will work?" asked the school principal, skeptically observing the structure that seemed too fragile to deliver all that Sarah promised. "I don't think so," she replied, adjusting the last filter. "I'm sure." 3 days later, a storm hit the city. Sarah stayed awake all night, looking out the window, calculating precipitation volumes and system efficiency. The next morning, ignoring Emily's advice to rest, she drove to the school under the persistent rain. What she found there changed everything. The schoolyard, normally flooded after heavy rains, was completely dry. The cisterns, designed to store up to 5,000 liters, were almost full. And the water, when tested, was clean enough not only for irrigation, but also for non-potable use within the school premises. The news spread quickly. A local newspaper published a small article. A local counselor, seeking to associate his image with sustainable projects, appeared for a photo. And, most importantly, representatives from 2 other schools contacted Sarah for quotes. "We're growing, my love," Sarah excitedly told Ethan as she helped him with his homework that night. "Soon, we'll need a real office." Ethan looked up from his notebook, where he struggled with letters that stubbornly jumbled before his eyes. Something that was beginning to worry Sarah, though she hadn't yet dared to investigate. "Can we paint it blue? Like water?" Sarah smiled, running her fingers through her son's hair. "We can paint it any color you want." It was on one of those rare nights when Emily convinced her to go out for dinner that fate prepared an unexpected encounter. The restaurant was simple but cozy. For the first time in months, Sarah had dressed up, putting on a dress long forgotten in her wardrobe, and even applying a soft lipstick to her lips, which had been colorless for so long. "You look beautiful," Emily commented, with genuine approval in her eyes. "You should do this more often." "Do what? Remember, I'm a woman besides a mother and a desperate entrepreneur?" Sarah tried to joke, but there was a painful truth in her words. It was then that she heard muffled sobbing from the next table. Turning discreetly, she immediately recognized the face. Jessica, the woman for whom Mark had abandoned her. Her first instinct was to get up and leave. How could she bear to share the same space with the person who had helped destroy her family? Her heart raced, and for a moment Sarah felt the familiar onset of an anxiety attack. But then something unexpected happened. Observing more closely, she realized that Jessica was alone. Her shoulders slumped in a posture Sarah knew all too well. The posture of someone carrying an invisible burden. "Give me a minute," she murmured to Emily, who looked confused as Sarah got up. Approaching the table, Sarah silently extended a tissue. Jessica looked up, her red eyes widening in immediate recognition. The shock on her face was palpable. "Here." Sarah's own voice sounded strange to her ears, calm, controlled, almost compassionate. "You seem to need this more than I do." Jessica accepted the tissue with trembling hands, unable to look away. Why? After everything? Sarah was surprised by her own answer. Because I've cried enough to know what it's like. A heavy silence settled between them, loaded with untold stories and shared pains. Finally, Jessica found her voice again. He's not who I thought he was, she confessed, the words coming out in a strangled whisper. Mark, he seemed so perfect at first, so passionate, so attentive. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. How many times had she used those exact words to describe the beginning of her relationship with Mark? Let me guess, Sarah said, surprising herself with the absence of bitterness in her voice. First, he puts you on a pedestal. Then, slowly, he starts to criticize little things. Your clothes, your friends, your opinions. Until one day, you realize you've reshaped your entire life to please him. And even then, it's never enough. Jessica's eyes widened in shock. How did you? I was married to him for 7 years, Sarah replied simply. And I've lived with the consequences for another. Between tears, Jessica confessed that Mark was as controlling and manipulative with her as he had been with Sarah. She spoke of how he had gradually isolated her from friends and family, how he questioned every penny she spent, how he turned any disagreement into proof that she didn't love him enough. Last night, Jessica continued, her voice breaking, he threw away a project I'd worked on for months because he said it was stealing time that should be dedicated to him. It was research on solar energy for isolated communities, something that could really make a difference. A strange feeling washed over Sarah. It wasn't exactly empathy nor forgiveness, but a recognition. An understanding that perhaps Jessica, too, was, in her own way, a victim of Mark. You have a choice, she said finally, her words carrying a weight that came from lived experience. I didn't know I had one until it was too late. Don't make the same mistake I did. Returning to her table, Emily stared open-mouthed. You just comforted the woman who stole your husband. Sarah, are you all right? Sarah picked up her glass of water, watching the condensation droplets trickle down like tiny tears on the glass surface. For a moment, she saw herself reflected in those drops, fragmented, yet somehow still whole. No, I just showed myself that I haven't become bitter as I feared. And perhaps I also found an unlikely ally. That night marked something important. Upon entering her apartment and looking at the Revive Waters prototypes, Sarah understood that she wasn't just creating a system to capture rainwater, but also a way to channel her own pain into something productive. The drops that fell from the sky were like the tears she had shed, seemingly useless when wasted, but powerful when collected and directed with purpose. The next morning, still reflecting on the encounter with Jessica, Sarah received an email that would change everything. A small rural town council wanted to implement her system in a rural school that suffered from water scarcity during dry months. It was a small contract, but real. A chance to prove that her technology worked beyond paper. Are we going to do it, Mummy? Ethan asked as she told him the news during breakfast. His little eyes sparkled with a mix of pride and hope that squeezed Sarah's heart. She hugged him tightly, feeling his small heart beat against hers. Each beat was precious, a reminder of the time that inexorably passed. Yes, my love, this is just the first drop. Soon we'll have an entire ocean. That afternoon, as she prepared the documents for the contract, Sarah felt a sharp, familiar pain radiating from the base of her skull. Her medicine was in her bag across the room, but it seemed as distant as the moon. Her vision darkened momentarily at the edges, and she leaned against the table, breathing deeply, fighting against the wave of panic that always accompanied these episodes. Not yet, she whispered to herself, as if she could negotiate with her own condition. I still have so much to do. When the pain finally subsided, Sarah looked at the calendar on the wall. 365 days already marked. A year since the diagnosis. 1/5 of her predicted time had already passed, but instead of despair, she felt renewed determination. Sarah's life was now measured in small victories. The first successfully installed system, the sparkle in Ethan's eyes upon seeing his drawing transformed into reality, the phone call from a second interested client, a night without pain severe enough to wake her. Each achievement was an act of rebellion against the time stolen from her, both by Mark and by her illness. "You should be taking better care of yourself," Emily insisted, worried about the pace her sister maintained. "It's no use saving the world if you're not here to see it." "I am taking care of myself," Sarah replied, with a quiet determination that had replaced her initial despair. "In the only way I know how, building something that remains after I'm gone." On nights when loneliness weighed heaviest, Sarah sat by her bedroom window, watching the city sleep. Somewhere out there, Mark continued his life, probably unaware that the woman he had abandoned was, little by little, building something greater than anything he had ever created. Somewhere out there, perhaps Jessica was making difficult decisions that would change her future. And right there, in the next room, Ethan slept peacefully, dreaming of water slides and little blue men. As night fell over the city, Sarah contemplated her small, nascent empire. In just 1 year, she had gone from abandoned wife to promising entrepreneur. The path was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt she was navigating her own waters, no longer drowning, but learning to flow with life's currents, even the most turbulent ones. "Revive waters," she murmured to herself, observing the rain that began to fall softly outside, each drop carrying a promise of renewal. "Perhaps it's not just a name for the company, but also for me." How do you think Sarah will continue to battle her illness while pursuing her dreams? What kind of unexpected challenges or allies do you foresee for her? Share your predictions in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of courage and transformation. The ultimate battle. "He's not keeping up with the other students." Ethan's teacher's words hung in the small meeting room, heavy as storm clouds. Sarah sat straighter in her chair, her hands unconsciously gripping her purse. "What exactly does that mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Ms. Davies, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes behind square glasses, pushed some papers across the table. They were Ethan's assignments, now 8 years old. Sarah immediately recognized her son's uneven handwriting. Inverted letters, incomplete words, sentences that seemed to dance across the page without apparent order. "Ethan is extremely creative, and his verbal comprehension is exceptional," Ms. Davies continued, "but he's having great difficulty with reading and writing. I've noticed he frequently inverts letters, confuses right and left, and seems to struggle to associate sounds with corresponding letters." Sarah ran her fingers over the pages, feeling each uncertain stroke like a small stab to her heart. How had she not noticed? She had been so consumed by work, by illness, by the fight to secure her son's financial future, that she had missed important signs right before her eyes. "We want to suggest an evaluation with our educational psychologist," Ms. Davies continued. "We suspect Ethan may have dyslexia." The word fell like a weight on Sarah's chest. Dyslexia. A new battle for her son to face. Another obstacle on a path already too difficult for such a young child. "Of course," she agreed automatically, though her mind was already calculating costs, reorganizing budgets, sacrificing some other need to accommodate whatever Ethan required. "I'll do whatever is necessary." Upon leaving the school, a sharp pain shot through her right temple, so intense that Sarah had to lean against the corridor wall. Lately, the episodes were becoming more frequent, harder to ignore. Dr. Thomas had expressed concern at her last appointment, suggesting medication adjustments, additional tests that would consume even more of her scarce resources. "Mummy, are you okay?" Ethan's voice brought her back, his worried little eyes observing her intently. Sarah forced a smile, straightening up with effort. "Just a little tired, my love. Shall we go home?" On the way, Ethan excitedly talked about a science project his class was developing, something about the water cycle, a topic that always fascinated him due to his mother's work. Sarah listened, nodding at the right moments, but her mind was divided between the physical pain throbbing behind her eyes and the new concern that had just been added to her already long list. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, voraciously researching dyslexia. She absorbed articles, parent testimonials, teaching strategies, therapeutic resources, anything that could help her understand what her son was facing and how she could support him. Among her readings, one sentence stood out. "Dyslexia is not an indicator of intelligence. Many people with dyslexia have above-average IQs and excel in areas like problem-solving, creative thinking, and spatial visualization." Sarah thought of the water slide drawing that had inspired her filtration system improvement. She thought of Ethan's incredible ability to build complex structures with building blocks, how he could visualize solutions that even she, a trained engineer, couldn't immediately see. "Your brain is special," she whispered to her sleeping son later, when she checked to make sure he was well covered. "Not broken, just special." The following weeks were filled with evaluations, meetings, and an official diagnosis that confirmed the teacher's suspicions: moderate dyslexia, accompanied by some ADHD characteristics. The treatment plan would involve specialized therapy twice a week and classroom adaptations. Revive Waters began to gain modest recognition. After the first successful projects in schools, a small condominium had hired Sarah to implement her system, followed by an organic farm seeking sustainable irrigation solutions. They weren't highly profitable contracts. Sarah often charged just enough to cover costs and ensure a small profit for reinvestment. But they built a solid reputation. Chloe, her assistant, now worked full-time, taking on responsibilities that allowed Sarah to better balance her time between the company and Ethan's needs. Emily continued to be a pillar of support, often caring for her nephew during afternoons when Sarah had meetings or when the pains became too incapacitating to disguise. It was in this context that Mark reappeared after almost 6 months of no contact. A call on a Sunday afternoon, asking to see his son. Sarah hesitated. Previous visits had been painful for Ethan, who would be anxious for days before and deeply disappointed afterward when his father inevitably canceled at the last minute or showed up for only an hour before inventing some urgent commitment. "I have news to tell him," Mark insisted on the phone, his voice carrying that familiar note of authority that brooked no refusal. "For Ethan's sake," Sarah agreed. She dressed her son in his favorite outfit, a blue t-shirt with water droplet prints that she had specially made for him, and tried to control her own expectations as they waited in the living room. Mark arrived half an hour late, without any explanation or apology. He entered the small apartment with the dominant presence he always had, looking around with thinly disguised condescension. "You still haven't found a better place?" was his greeting to Sarah, before turning to Ethan with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So, champ, how's school?" The innocent question triggered a series of events that Sarah would never forget. Ethan, in a mix of excitement and nervousness from being with his father, began to talk about his recent diagnosis, explaining in simple words how letters sometimes danced on the page and how he was attending special classes to help him. Mark's face transformed, hardening into a mask of disapproval. "Dyslexia? That's just an excuse for lazy kids. In my day, kids who couldn't read properly just tried harder." Ethan's hopeful smile vanished instantly, his little eyes filling with tears. Sarah felt something snap inside her. Not her aneurysm, but some last reserve of regard she still held for the man she had once loved. "Get out!" she whispered, her voice trembling not from fear, but from a cold fury she had never experienced before. "Get out of my house now!" Mark seemed shocked, as if he had never imagined she would dare to confront him. "You can't stop me from seeing my son." "Your son?" Sarah laughed, a humorless sound. "You've only remembered you have a son 3 times in the last 6 months, and now you have the audacity to invalidate a diagnosed medical condition because it doesn't fit your perfect vision of how he should be." Ethan watched the confrontation with wide eyes, a small hand gripping his mother's t-shirt hem. "The door is there," Sarah pointed, keeping her voice controlled despite the tremor in her hands. "Next time you want to see Ethan, it will be through supervised visits, as determined by the court, and I suggest you educate yourself on dyslexia before then." After Mark left, slamming the door hard enough to make the hallway nurse appear alarmed, Emily looked at her sister with a mix of shock and admiration. "That was liberating," Sarah added, feeling strangely energized despite her physical exhaustion. "I should have done that years ago." That night, alone in her hospital room, Sarah made the final decision about the experimental procedure. She sent an email to Chloe with detailed instructions about the company. She called her lawyer formalizing the partial sale of her shares and wrote a long letter to Ethan. A letter she hoped he would never have to read, but which contained everything she wanted him to know should the worst happen. When Dr. Thomas came to make his last round, he found her calmly looking out the hospital window at the illuminated city. "I've decided to have the procedure," she informed him bluntly. "I want every extra day I can have with my son." Dr. Thomas nodded, a slight smile forming at the corner of his lips. "I suspected that would be your decision. We'll begin preparations tomorrow." He hesitated for a moment, something clearly on his mind. "Sarah, there's an opportunity I'd like to discuss with you. A pilot project in the Highlands for the implementation of sustainable water systems in drought-affected communities. When you recover, well, we're looking for specialists who can lead the initiative in the field." Sarah looked at him, surprised. "You're offering me a job? Now?" "I'm offering a purpose for your recovery," he corrected gently. "Something to plan for, to visualize while we fight for your life." For the first time in weeks, a spark of true hope ignited in Sarah's chest. Not just the possibility of more time, but the chance to use that time to do exactly what she had always dreamed of: bring her technology to those who needed it most. "Why are you doing this for me?" she asked, genuinely intrigued by this man's persistent interest in her well-being. Dr. Thomas briefly held her hand, a professional gesture, but with a gentleness that communicated something more. "Because I believe some lives are measured not in years, but in impact. And yours, Sarah Miller, has only just begun to make ripples in the world." That night, as the city slept and the hospital corridors quieted, Sarah allowed herself, for the first time in a long time, to dream not just of survival, but of life. A life beyond illness, beyond daily struggle, beyond the constant fear of the end. And, in those dreams, she saw not just Ethan growing strong and confident, not just her company flourishing and helping communities, but also new possibilities she hadn't dared to consider, like the sparkle in a doctor's kind eyes, who spoke of purpose and impact as if they were the same thing as hope. The true victory. Under the intense Highland sun, Sarah observed the horizon where the blue sky met the parched earth. A year had passed since the experimental procedure that, against all odds, had granted her a second chance. The scar, almost imperceptible near her right temple, was the only visible trace of the battle her body had fought. A battle she was, according to the latest tests, winning. "Ready?" Dr. Bent approached, offering her a bottle of water, He was no longer just Dr. Ben. In recent months, he had become simply Ben, a friend, a confidant, and gradually, something more that neither of them yet dared to name. Sarah smiled, accepting the water, born ready for this moment. Before her, the first complete Revive water system, on a community scale, stood like a sculpture against the rural skyline. Collection tanks, cascading filters, underground reservoirs, all designed to transform the rare but intense rains of the region into a constant supply of water for a community of 300 people who, for generations, had lived at the mercy of drought. More impressive than the physical structure was what it represented. After the successful procedure, Sarah had dived headfirst into the project proposed by Ben. Revive Waters was no longer just a small, struggling company. It had become the center of an internationally funded pilot project with the potential to revolutionize access to water in arid regions around the world. "Mommy, look!" Ethan, now 10, ran towards her. A year of specialized therapies had worked wonders. His reading had significantly improved, and his self-confidence had grown with his height. "Mrs. Henderson taught me how to make a filter with plastic bottles and sand. It really works." Sarah hugged her son, feeling her heart overflow with gratitude. Every day with Ethan was a gift that had almost been denied to her. "That's wonderful, my love. Perhaps we can add your filter to the manual we're creating for schools." Ethan's face lit up with the suggestion. "Really? I'll draw the instructions properly." As he ran back to the community house where they were staying, Sarah exchanged a meaningful look with Ben. Both knew what went unsaid, how precious every moment like this was, how every smile from Ethan was a victory against the time that had almost been stolen from them. "He's flourishing here," Ben commented. "I never imagined an urban child would adapt so well to the highlands." "Ethan always had that gift of finding beauty where others see only scarcity," Sarah replied softly. "Perhaps because from an early age he needed to find strength in difficult situations." The system's inauguration was scheduled for the next day. Local authorities, representatives from the funding NGO, and even a team of documentary filmmakers would be present. The pilot project had attracted international attention, especially after Revive Water's legal victory against the corporations that tried to block their patents. That legal battle had become a turning point for Sarah. When her lawyers presented the documents proving Mark had stolen her original project, the tide turned completely. The scandal splashed onto several corporations, exposing unethical practices that went far beyond her personal case. Mark saw his business empire crumble as a wider investigation revealed years of tax and environmental irregularities. Sarah felt no pleasure in Mark's downfall, only a strange sense of justice finally being restored. The night before the inauguration, while Ethan slept, exhausted after a day exploring the project with local children, Sarah and Ben sat on the porch of the simple community house, gazing at the starry sky only the highlands could offer. "Have you ever thought about giving up?" Ben asked suddenly. "Throughout this whole process, the illness, the company, the legal battles, was there ever a moment you just wanted to throw in the towel?" Sarah was silent for a moment, considering the question. "Every day," she finally admitted. "Every morning I woke up in pain. Every night I spent sleepless worrying about Ethan's future. Every time Mark tried to diminish me, or those corporations threatened everything I had worked for. Yes, I thought about giving up. But I couldn't." "You couldn't," Ben completed softly. "I couldn't. When you have someone who depends completely on you, giving up isn't an option." And then, over time, I realized I wasn't just fighting for Ethan, but also for myself, for the woman I always knew I could be, if I had the chance. Ben gently took her hand, his fingers intertwining as if they belonged together. "Tomorrow, when you stand on that platform, hundreds of people will see what I see every day. A woman who turns obstacles into opportunities, pain into purpose. "And what exactly do you see every day, Dr. Thomas?" Sarah asked, a lightness in her voice that had been rediscovered during her months in the Highlands. "I see someone who reminds me daily that our lives are measured not by the time we have, but by what we do with that time." He hesitated, then continued more softly. "I see someone who made me believe in second chances again after I lost my wife." The words hung between them, full of unsaid possibilities. Sarah felt something inside her expand, not the aneurysm that still resided in her brain, controlled, but not eliminated, but rather that part of her heart that had closed the day Mark abandoned her. The morning of the inauguration dawned with a clear sky and an already intense heat at 7 o'clock. The entire community had mobilized, decorating the space around the system with colorful flags. Children ran excitedly. Women had prepared traditional foods. Men checked the last technical details with the Revive Waters team. When it was time for Sarah to speak, she felt a surprising calm. Ethan and Ben were in the front row, both radiating pride. Chloe, who had come especially for the event, represented the entire team that had made that dream possible. And surprisingly, Jessica was also present. After their encounter at the restaurant years ago, they had developed an unlikely friendship, culminating in Jessica eventually joining the company as a solar energy specialist. "This system we're inaugurating today isn't just about water," Sarah began, her voice clear, carrying through the makeshift sound system. "It's about transformation, about taking something many consider scarce or impossible and revealing its hidden potential." Looking at those hopeful faces, Sarah made a spontaneous decision. It was time to share her complete story. Few people know this, but when I started this project, I received a diagnosis of a brain aneurysm. The doctors gave me 5 years to live. A murmur went through the audience. Today, I am here, 4 years after that diagnosis, not just surviving, but living fully, thanks to an experimental treatment and the determination not to let my limited time define what I could achieve. Her eyes met Ethan's, who looked at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. She had never told her son the full severity of her condition. "I learned that our greatest limitations often hide our greatest strengths, that systems that seem broken, be they water distribution, social structures, or even our own bodies, can be redesigned, reimagined, reborn." Sarah gestured to the system behind her. This technology was born of necessity, refined by adversity, and now exists to serve everyone, regardless of status or resources. Because I believe that access to clean water is not a privilege, it is a fundamental human right. At the end of her speech, when the ribbon was cut, and water began to flow through the distribution systems for the first time, Sarah observed the joy on the faces of the children running under the first jets. She saw women who, for the first time in their lives, wouldn't have to walk kilometers daily to fetch water. She witnessed the impossible transformed into reality through vision, perseverance, and the courage to reinvent what seemed immutable. In that moment, feeling the warmth of the Highland sun on her skin and Ethan's hand firmly in hers, Sarah understood the truth that had guided her journey, even without realizing it. It is not our circumstances that define who we are, but the choices we make in the face of them. "Mommy," Ethan whispered, looking at her with eyes that mirrored her own. "When I grow up, I want to do something like this too, something that helps people." Sarah hugged her son, feeling tears of gratitude form in her eyes. "You already are, my love. Every time you choose to be kind, every time you persist despite difficulties, every time you use your imagination to solve a problem, you are already changing the world, drop by drop." And there, under the endless Highland sky, surrounded by waters reborn and lives transformed, Sarah finally understood that she had built not just a technological or business legacy, but something far more valuable, a living testament that our ability to positively impact the world around us is not limited by the time we have, but by the courage we demonstrate with each new dawn. Would you have the courage to share your deepest struggles publicly to inspire others, like Sarah did? What part of Sarah's journey resonates most with you? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps us create more meaningful stories. If you were moved by this tale, please give it a like, share it, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring narratives. Thank you for watching until the very end.